For a significant chunk of the history of video games, it was a major overarching goal to eventually move from 2D to 3D. The first fully 3D game using polygonal graphics, you might be surprised to find out, was actually from 1983, a little game called iRobot. Thanks Google, but it wasn't until the mid-90s that 3D games had started to become the...
A game called iRobot was the first to... That is interesting. Was it based on any of Isaac Asimov's stories, or is it just called that?
Polygonal graphics, you might be surprised to find out, was actually from 1983, a little game called iRobot. Thanks Google, but it wasn't until the mid-90s that 3D games had started to become the norm. Graphics and technology had advanced to the point where even the lowest of low-rent developers could theoretically implement polygonal graphics. This of course led to the early to mid-90s Wild West that I was so fond of, where tons of developers of varying skill levels were individually attempting to test the waters to see what worked and what didn't work as far as 3D gaming was concerned. They were the pioneers, the ground...
But I could be waiting on medicine. I see. Is this Virtua Fighter? I see. Well, that sounds nice. Sounds nice that you're doing well. I'm glad.
And while the cream of the crop has risen...
oh yeah, I've never played Virtua Fighter. I have played this Spider-Man game. I loved it as a kid. I'm not sure if I could ever finish it personally. Oh no, I remember the final section with Doc Ock. It was super intense. I remember my entire hands shaking when I finally did it. No, I think I beat it. But that first level, of course, is stuck in my mind. I don't think I remember any other ones, except the final fight. But that first level is burned into my mind, where you have to swing across the buildings, and then you sneak into that one building, you sneak across the ceiling, and like try to take out those bad guys, save the hostages. Oh, that was so cool.
To the top.
I also had the sequel, Enter Electro, Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro. That was even more intense, but I think it was more linear, if I remember correctly.
Grandness of time, there were dozens, if not hundreds, of examples of attempts at 3D games that completely fell flat due to a combination of inexperience with the added perspective and the general jankiness that came with the technology.
Hot take, GoldenEye. GoldenEye did not age well. It's a legendary game, a revolutionary game, but not one that aged well at all.
Limitations as well as the new technology. And while it may not have been the worst, one of the more notorious examples of that transition from 2D to 3D would be Prince of Persia 3D. Now, Prince of Persia was a big deal for its day. It's still a relatively big IP, but it's been surpassed. It was the innovator of the realistic platformer genre. Featuring gorgeous rotoscoped animations, it stood out in...
I will never forgive Assassin's Creed for effectively killing Prince of Persia. I will never forgive that.
Among its contemporaries. I played it back in the day. It was one of the first PC games I remember playing. Of course, I could never get past the first level because it was brutally difficult. But it was an innovator, it sold well, and it launched an entire franchise of games, starting with the sequel, Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame, and Knuckles. And of course, the third game, and as was the style...
I remember these first two Prince of Persia games. I always wanted to play them. I always wanted to get into them. I was never able to. And I remember they had remakes for phones, so and they looked pretty, those remakes, they looked like really good. And so I wanted to play them, but I never got to because they were eventually taken down. Why? 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 Prince of Persia was boring until Sands of Time. I was hooked then, amazing. Sands of Time, the Sands of Time series used to be my favorite game series ever. The third one especially used to be my favorite game ever. And the villain of the second one, the Dahaka, used to be my favorite video game villain ever. Until I replayed them somewhat recently and realized that the first game is actually the best one. But I loved them. I loved all of them. But again, I've never played Prince of Persia 3D. I think it's the only one I never even tried playing. I'm not sure if I ever played The Shadow and the Flame, but I did try out playing the first one, definitely. I know that. I'm not sure if I tried playing the second one, but I definitely never tried this one. I've always been so curious about it, but I know it's bad, so I never want to play it.
Time when you had a third game in a trilogy and it went to 3D, you didn't call it 3, you called it 3D. Hence, Prince of Persia 3D.
Wait, Wolfenstein 3D?
And of course, the third game, and Vader, it sold well, and it flame. And in a trilogy and it went to 3D, you didn't call it 3, you called it 3D.
Oh, Duke Nukem 3D, Wolfenstein, Bubsy 3D, Mario 64, but it wasn't the third one, I guess.
Hence Prince of Persia 3D in 1999. A game considered bad enough to have temporarily killed the Prince of Persia IP, and for some reason, this game is one that intrigues me, and I can't quite articulate why. I remember seeing the Dreamcast port at my local retro game shop back when I was in university. Keep in mind, I was living off my savings at the time, and something about this game grabbed me to the point where I was willing to spend $60 on it sight unseen. I guess its reputation preceded it. I wanted to see for myself if it really was one of the worst adaptations of a 2D game to 3D, and if it was truly as bad as its reputation would lead you to believe. I wanted to see all the ways in which you can botch a 3D adaptation. So that's going to be the theme for the—
But just looking at the footage, it does look fun to me. It looks like this old, like, Tomb Raider style, and, well, I've never really finished any of the old Tomb Raider games, but I've always wanted to. I have them all on Steam. Well, I don't have the remastered versions. I have the original versions, the original 90s games on Steam. I've always been wanting to play them. Now that the remasters are on the trilogy versions, I'd probably rather play those. Because they seem to be pretty good remasters from what I heard, but yeah.
Botched conversions. I'm going to be discussing both versions. I'll probably be focusing a bit more on the Dreamcast port because that's the version that I have more familiarity with. Also, it's the version that controls halfway decently, but rest assured, both versions will get their due. I'm not overly familiar with the Prince of Persia lore, especially pre-Sands of Time, so I'm not sure how much connection 3D has to the previous two games. Through a little bit of research, I found out that apparently Prince of Persia 2 ended on a cliffhanger that was never resolved, so apparently the answer is not very much. As it sits, the prince, that's you, the Sultan, as well as the prince's recent bride have all been invited to the palace of a neighboring country belonging to the Sultan's brother Asan. However, as it turns out, it's a trap. Apparently, there was a previous promise between the two sultans that the princess would marry Asan's son Ragnar, but the Prince of Persia marrying the princess broke that promise, and so now deep behind enemy lines, the prince is captured and thrown into the dungeons while Ragnar attempts to persuade the princess to marry him. Also, Ragnar is half tiger for no discernible reason other than to appease the furries. It's about as on par as what you would expect for the era as well as this sort of game. Prince rescues the princess, A plus B equals C. There's minimal twists, and a large chunk of the game is simply the chase. There's a part where the Sultan dies and the prince is framed, but that doesn't really lead anywhere, and the one interesting part of the plot is how the princess defies Ragnar.
The Sultan dying and the prince being framed, they also did that in the Sands of Time movie. I'm not sure if it was also from the if that plot element was taken from the Sands of Time game. Don't remember that, but it was definitely in the movie.
Refuses his advances and cuts off his hand. That's pretty metal, which ends up leading to one of the more unintentionally funny moments in the game. Following this, he decides he doesn't want to marry her. He decides instead to punish her by tying her to a giant gear in the middle of a clock tower, meaning when the clock strikes a certain time, she'll be crushed, and the prince would then metaphorically be crushed as well. Otherwise than that little twist, it's a serviceable plot that gets the job done. Not much to really analyze, which is fair enough because the real interesting aspect of the game to analyze is the gameplay. Nobody really ever complained about the plot, it was all about that gameplay, and that's for one simple reason.
Isn't it kind of the same with Tomb Raider Angel of Darkness that was apparently really bad, even though I find it interesting that it changed the setting into a modern setting, you know, taking place in a modern city, climbing around there. At least that's all I know of that game. I don't know if you actually go into any tombs, but it's interesting. It's an interesting change, and it's such a shame that it's such a bad reception. Let me close this up. It burns.
Gameplay is completely whack, and in some ways it's kind of a checklist of all the ways not to convert a 2D action game into 3D. There are a few major examples to bring up right off the bat, but the single most important thing to bring up immediately in my eyes is the absolutely atrocious combat. I don't use the term atrocious idly here. This might actually be the worst combat engine I've ever seen in a game. I see what they were going for here, don't get me wrong. The sword combat in the previous games was very simple. It basically boiled sword combat down to its simplest form. You block enemy attacks, and then you get a free hit, and if you attack, there's a chance that they may block your attack, and they get a free hit. So mastering blocking essentially breaks the combat. It's simple, which is fair enough. There are only so many ways you can make a combat engine like this, especially when you're dealing with only 2 dimensions. So keeping it simple and to the point with very few rules was a no-brainer. But in 3D, there are so many different ways you can make the combat more nuanced, especially in regards to integrating it into your traversal like the later Prince of Persia games did, or simply using the added perspective to add more depth to your arsenal. But instead, they essentially made a shot-for-shot transition of the combat from the first 2 games, where you have a normal mode and then you have a combat mode.
But I guess if this is a very early 3D game, they just didn't know any better, I guess. It's like kind of like the jump between consoles. We've seen this during my currently ongoing Resident Evil marathon, where like the first PS2 game, Code Veronica, still kind of felt like a glorified PS1 game, honestly, because it just had those same kind of quirks. You know, all the characters were super big on screen because they underestimated the new resolution. The gameplay didn't really improve in any noticeable way, and so on. Like, it still had the same kind of quirks. It felt like a glorified PS1 game. It just feels like that early transitional phase where they don't quite know what to do. Like, just like, for example, movies. The invention of movies, they were like the first real movies were shot like theater plays, because that's what people were used to at the time. That's what people knew at the time was theater. They didn't know what movies are. It was a new thing. And they didn't understand how to use this new medium to its fullest extent. It is understandable, but of course that doesn't change the datedness.
You go into combat stance, and you walk laboriously towards whatever enemy is in front of you, and you haphazardly slash at each other until somebody dies. I could not for the life of me figure out the combat engine, because it seems like the entire point is to block and then attack, but in practice it feels like you're flailing at each other aimlessly, especially because different attacks don't appear to have a higher chance of hitting. And the audio-visual feedback for hitting an enemy is basically non-existent. It feels like your attacks are just clipping through one another with no resistance and very little actual presentation. Also, blocking doesn't seem to guarantee that your next strike will hit. It's essentially completely random unless I'm doing something wrong. And it's entirely possible I'm doing something wrong, but from my experience, it's basically impossible to get through any combat scenario without losing some health, unless you get supremely lucky. As a matter of fact, given that this is random chance, I find it's actually expedient to quick save before every combat scenario, and if you lose more health than necessary, just quick load and hope the odds favor you more. Obviously, that's not necessarily an option in the Dream.
That sounds bad. Yeah, that's not necessarily an option in the Dreamcast
version, which is just as well, because the combat in the PC version is somehow the worst of the two. The PC version makes...
What? Was No Sense of Time movie, if there was, it would have been made well and awesome, and I would talk about it, but that never happened. I liked it. Like, it wasn't amazing or anything, but it was fine. It gave me that sense of that Tomb Raider type adventure sense with the parkour and stuff, and I like the setting. I don't know. It was fine. It's not like that Dragon Ball live action movie or like the Alone in the Dark movie where it's really just, you know, it's an awful abomination. The Sense of Time movie was fine. Oh, also, by the way, the newest Prince of Persia game, I keep saying how I can't forgive Assassin's Creed for basically killing Prince of Persia, because in case you don't know, the first Assassin's Creed game was originally meant to be a Prince of Persia game, a spin-off where you don't play the prince, but you play an assassin protecting the prince. But then it's the core concept of the game strayed so far away from the original Prince of Persia formula that they turned it into its own thing, and that became Assassin's Creed. But because Assassin's Creed was such a success, they never made any Prince of Persia games anymore, and I never forgave Assassin's Creed for that. The newest one is fantastic. Well, I guess they still made the Forgotten Sands, but that was just to coincide with the movie, okay? Fun fact, not an adaptation of the movie. The movie is already an adaptation of the game. The Forgotten Sands was an original 4th game in that same series. The weakest one, in my opinion. Still, after that, they sadly never made any more. And that's a shame. especially the Sands of Time series. I would love to see return in some form. I loved the parkour, and it was actually in some, well, it wasn't like super hard or anything, but you actually had to think about what you do, about your next move, and so on. It actually felt like parkour in a way, unlike especially the modern Assassin's Creed games where you literally just press one button and you just climb this building and it's just nothing, you know. I would love to make it see a return in some form. They put out the new game somewhat recently, a few years ago. What was it called again? Crown, something with Crown, I don't know. And that game was fantastic. It was an incredible Metroidvania, one of my favorites, genuinely. But I'm still wishing for another Sense of Time game. Or at least some other game, some other franchise that manages to capture that kind of feeling.
Because the combat in the PC version is somehow the worst of the two. The PC version makes the combat feel even more flaily and random. There's even less of a feeling of hit detection, and the AI is so brain dead that half the time you can kill the enemies while they're still walking towards you. Though funny story, I prefer WASD over the arrow keys for movement. It's a force of habit type deal. The left analog stick has become the default analog stick for movement in 3D gaming for the past god knows how many years. So to me, the left hand is for movement regardless of control method. But the default attack directions are also with WASD in this game, and I didn't register that fact. I thought the movement controls were replaced by the attack directions, so I thought for the first hour of gameplay that you couldn't move during combat. But the fact that the combat is so static that I didn't even need to move during the combat is a point against it, not for it. And it's definitely not technology limitations, because I found
the Spider-Man
so
game.
many games from this era with superb combat.
Right, you also found the lizard, right? I vaguely remember this. Was it in the sewers, the stage where you? Oh my god, no, I'm not even gonna try to remember. I will not. I was really small when I played this.
Engines. It all simply comes down to trying and failing to translate pre-established combat into 3D, and it simply doesn't work. Which is sad, because they definitely put a lot of effort into it, given that there are several different weapons you can get. Both versions have unique weapons, like these dual blades in the PC version, but personally I think the Dreamcast version has the better weapons, even though most of them just serve to
They have different weapons, that's interesting, even though it's basically the same game, right?
make the combat situational easier, like the sword that prevents you from being shot with arrows while it's drawn, which is useful all of like once in the entire game. But then you also have such things as the fire sword, which simply does more damage. We even have a sword that doesn't look like a sword at all because it's a bow and arrow. And you're given different arrows you can fire, which can be quite useful, though gameplay hot tip, save anything that insta-kills enemies for the final boss, either arrows or swords. Because since the thing is on a time limit on account of your wife being tied to a giant gear, you want to spend as little time fighting him as possible. And anything death-based does one entire section of damage. Overall, the combat just isn't particularly enjoyable because it's so static and so completely one-dimensional. I'm not speaking with any hyperbole when I say this might be one of the worst combat engines I've ever experienced, if not the worst. And the fact
that is kind of crazy because it just doesn't look that bad. Like, that is always the trouble with explaining bad gameplay, is that the people you're explaining it to aren't experiencing. So you have to try extra hard to come up with comparisons. How does it compare to other games? How do I explain a feeling? You know? Like, it doesn't look like horrible combat. And it's such, like, you know, these kinds of things are so hard to explain. I struggle with that so much when, in like every game I play, when I feel like some nuances are off, I try to explain them in some way, but sometimes it just doesn't come across.
The fact that the damage you take is seemingly so random, it's almost more expedient not to bother. Yeah, at some point during my initial playthrough, I found that there are very few combat scenarios that were necessary. There are a few combat scenarios very early on that are required to continue, but after a certain point, there's nothing stopping you from just
with the tank controls, of course, I have to think of survival horror games because they kind of did tank controls a lot, and still do to this day. But it kind of feels like, look at this. This looks like a Mario stage, doesn't it? It kind of feels like a mix. Like if it's a jump and run like this, it kind of feels like a mix between Mario, Tomb Raider, something like that. but with the slow gameplay of a Resident Evil, with the tank controls. And also apparently some of the worst combat ever. Yeah, if you break it down like this, it doesn't actually sound like a lot of fun.
Running past a lot of these obstacles. And as a matter of fact,
This is literally... I wouldn't be surprised if this animation was literally the Tomb Raider, the original Tomb Raider animation. Look at this.
there's nothing
For climbing
stopping
up.
you from just running past
Jumping so high and climbing up, that is literally Tomb Raider.
a lot of these obstacles. And as a matter of fact, it's actually better to do so because there are limited healing items. In the PC version, every
Actually, the original Tomb Raider games also had tank controls, right?
healing item is a one and done. You can't store them, so you either drink them on the spot or you move on if you don't need them. So there are times where you might need them but don't have them, and then in the Dreamcast version you can save 4 healing items, so you want to save your healing items for the more important fights. Meaning it's better to just simply not bother with a lot of the lesser fights. Most enemies don't even follow you past certain points of no return, and some of them are even blocked by loading screens. Besides, it's not like you get anything for fighting most enemies. Outside of the odd healing item, there's no reward for fighting. The fighting is largely done as an obstacle in your way, but the environments are big enough that they're barely in your way. There's even at least one instance I can think of off the top of my head where killing one enemy will spawn a harder enemy, so if you just run past the easier enemy, you don't have to deal with the extra gameplay challenge. Imagine this, viewers. The combat is so inherently unfun, so unsatisfying, and so haphazard that not engaging with it, not engaging with one of the core mechanics, makes the game more fun. How sad is that? So yeah, I appreciate the effort, it's just a damn shame the design philosophies were misplaced, and the overall result was completely shithouse. I feel like there are certain aspects of the game that do work in 3D. Most notably, I think the platforming and traversal is actually quite fun and nuanced at times.
Okay.
It's slow and at times laborious, but I feel like the added weight of having realistic platforming scenarios makes the slowness compelling because it makes successfully pulling off simple but difficult challenges really rewarding.
Okay.
There are a lot of instances where you have to, much like the previous games, perform incredibly tightly done sequences of platforming. For example, it's not enough just to be able to swing across a pit of spikes. You also have to grab onto the edge because there are spikes at the top, so if you swing too far, you die. This was a staple of Prince of Persia design, not only knowing where to go and when to jump, but also these specific distances to stand back so you don't overshoot and find yourself in the midst of a hazard.
See, that's the kind of stuff I want back in gaming, please. Give me like 1, 2, 3 AAA games like this, please. With the AAA kind of quality. Actually, at this point, also with the indie kind of quality, honestly. Just give me some games like this where with actual parkour and where it feels like, you know, when you get through a section, like you actually achieved something. Give me something like this, please.
And some of those later sequences are really satisfying to get through, like this one part towards the end of the game where you have to jump in a specific way to grab onto the edge, but also not hit the spikes. Then you need to drop down, swing on a pole, and then swing to a stationary rope. That took a number of tries.
Yeah, it
The
looks
comparison
like
to
it.
Tomb Raider is somewhat unavoidable, given that both are 3D action-adventure games with lots of box pushing, climbing,
Okay, the animation is slightly different. Okay.
platforming, and falling to your death after misjudging the length of a jump. It's hard for me to say whether or not this is actually a Tomb Raider ripoff. The platforming was definitely trying to take the same design philosophies, so they may have used Tomb Raider as somewhat of an inspiration as far as level design or how to control the character in 3D. But then again, Prince of Persia came first and could very well have been taking the same
Yes, but Prince of Persia 3D didn't come first, right?
design philosophies and converting them to 3D. It's hard to say. It's one
Like,
of those
it's just like with Resident Evil, how Resident Evil used to be that influential, what's the word? That groundbreaking, no, that visionary game originally, but now with 5 and 6 we see how it devolved into being a less inspired clone of some, not necessarily clone, but very uninspiredly inspired by other games, like Call of Duty, like Uncharted, like Tomb Raider, and trying to emulate those successes. Successfully so, but that's like such a... yeah. But that is also possible with Prince of Persia.
chicken and egg situations where you can't be sure where the inspiration comes from. To me, it comes across simply as the fact that 3D Prince of Persia would always be reminiscent of Tomb Raider, and Tomb Raider was wildly popular at the time, so you're never going to get away from that. You're never going to get away from the comparison. Even still, if we're going with the parallels to Tomb Raider, I also don't think that Tomb Raider in its earliest form controlled particularly well. Matter of fact, given that early Tomb Raider came before analog movement or dual analog controls, I found the control workarounds they did implement to make the game functional with limited technology was awkward and has aged poorly. The same definitely applies here. It may not be as dire, but it's in the same direction. I find the type of gameplay they were going for.
Okay, so he's basically saying that the controls in Prince of Persia 3D feel better than in Tomb Raider. That's interesting.
Or needed
Bullshit, but okay.
far more than what the Dreamcast controller gave you. You needed proper camera controls. You needed the extra buttons of a more standard controller. You needed the extra precision that a dual analog setup
I thought you were playing Tomb Raider. Why would I play Tomb Raider doing a Resident Evil marathon?
would give you. It's acceptable, but it feels
I
like
know
it's held back by its limitations and needed something more. It's at least playable though. Meanwhile, the PC version is practically unplayable as far as the controls are concerned. But it has nothing to do with the actual specific button inputs themselves, because I actually rearranged the button inputs to something that I like. The larger issue is the fact that the controls feel strangely unresponsive on the PC, and this applies to every aspect of the game, even combat. Sometimes I would click the button to pull out my sword and the prince just wouldn't do it, causing me to have to reload the combat sequence because I was standing there while I was being cut to ribbon. But it was even worse for platforming. I had to quick save pretty much before every single jump because it was even odds whether or not I would actually properly jump or if the prince would arbitrarily fall to his death.
Okay,
Sometimes
that sounds horrible. What the fuck? Yes, tank controls, yes, but the designers knew the limitations at the time and designed the level structure around it. It's grid-based. Well, so is this one, right?
I was smacking the jump key 5 times just to make sure that he would actually jump. And the funny thing is, it only really applied during running jumps. I can do stationary jumps just fine, but for some reason, trying to get him to do a running jump and actually, jump was more art than science. And it gets even worse when you have
Can't jump properly, but says has better controls than Tomb Raider, bitch needs to get good. But that's not... What? He's complaining about the PC version here. The Dreamcast version seems to work just fine. Right now he's complaining about the PC version that for some reason just refuses to jump sometimes or refuses to do what he says sometimes. But at the same time he does say that the gameplay feels better than Tomb Raider. Like the jumping and stuff. Tomb Raider was just as good on all 3 platforms. Okay, cool, but that is besides the point. That is not the point that he's making. That you're arguing a completely different point right now.
to swing on a rope. I swear, trying to collide with the rope required an act of God half the time. Meaning that this game got very difficult very quick in any circumstance where quick precision was required. The only saving grace is the quick save and quick load. Without that, I'd have packed the PC version in after 15 minutes. It also doesn't help that the PC version is seemingly poorly optimized. I think anyway. My virtual machine is a beefcake. I specifically set up my virtual machine to basically be able to run anything pre-2004 at max settings, so the game has no right to be chugging as hard as it is. And when you combine the shoddy frame rate with the really unresponsive controls, it makes the PC version come across as even less fun when it already wasn't exactly a Game of the Year contender to begin with. I will acquiesce to the fact that
You're gonna make comparison between other games and say one has better control scheme than another, then... But he didn't say the control scheme is better. He said the controls feel better. He also said that in the PC version, he changed the control scheme to something that he likes. So clearly it's not the control scheme that's the problem. The control scheme is probably the same. Because, well, that's how tank controls work.
it may not be the game's fault on account of the virtual machine. I'm no expert.
Tomb Raider works on all forms. Yeah, that's why it's a better game. He's also saying how bad this game is. But the controls can still feel good, right? Even if the game is bad.
experts in retro PC games, hence why I try to avoid them as much as I can, so I'm not sure if it's the emulation's fault. To its credit though, it wasn't as glitchy as I expected. I heard that this was an incredibly glitchy game, but in my experience, I don't remember encountering any glitches, and this is the 1.0 version. Since I ripped this game from an abandonware website, it wasn't installed on my virtual machine in the traditional sense, so I couldn't patch it. But the fact that there was a keyboard fix I couldn't figure out how to implement properly probably means the unresponsiveness of the controls aren't anything new or groundbreaking as far as takes are concerned. But still, no glitches from what I could tell. I think the textures briefly disappeared at one point, and you could probably tell this game was rushed graphically given the abundance of flat textures and the fact that the prince himself looks really weird. Something just seems
What is this? Okay, nice.
off about his face, like he's a 3D render
But it is interesting that the mouths are actually moving. That's kind of unexpected.
of a political cartoon. Otherwise than that, the game was stable enough. But even if the game controlled well, had better combat, had equally good performance on both the Dreamcast and the PC, it still wouldn't fix what is probably the most annoying issue with Prince of Persia 3D/Arabian Nights, the arbitrary death traps. Yes, I know that instant kill death traps were a staple of Prince of Persia, but there's a reason why they worked in 2D. When you're viewing the game from the side, you're seeing an entire screen's worth of game environment. You were able to reasonably suss out what is and is not a trap from a distance, because you can see a large chunk of the immediate surrounding playable space. This wasn't always the case, of course. There were cases of trial and error in the original games, as was the style at the time, but at the very least, if something was an obvious trap, you could reasonably predict it because of the extremely wide field of view. The problem is now, in 3D and in third person, your perception of the environment shrinks a lot. It basically shrinks to your immediate surroundings and not much else. When you combine that with the fact that these games have a significant
But that just sounds like a bad translation of 2D to 3D, and that is just what games this early just suffered from. Often, like it's like this transitional phase where people didn't really know how to implement things in this other format. It's bad. At least I see where it's coming from.
significantly lower resolution than the average game these days, it creates a toxic cocktail where you have no reasonable way to predict when something is going to pop out in front of you and kill you instantly until it does. It's hard to see a lot of these things because they blend into the environment
What the hell is that thing? How does that even kill him?
in a lot of instances. You have to have eagle eyes to predict when half of these hazards are going to show up.
Okay, that one was obvious though.
Sometimes even that's not enough, like how in the PC version, there were these columns that rise up from the ground and crush you. But there's no immediately obvious indication of how you're supposed to know that these specific spots have the crushing mechanisms. It's to the point where in the Dreamcast version, they actually had to add different colored tiles in those spots to indicate
Wait, did the Dreamcast version come later?
that those spots were hazards. But even the Dreamcast version doesn't get away from this. Oh no, there were several instances in the Dreamcast version
It's insane that this dude played through this game twice on different platforms just to give a proper comparison. That's insane.
where I found myself casually walking through the environment and getting decapitated by a guillotine or getting chomped by a mechanism because there was no visual indication. Once again, if you could see the entire environment around you like in the 2D games, you'd be able to immediately see a giant hanging blade above you. But because in this case you generally only see the area immediately surrounding you, you rarely need to look up, so it wouldn't have crossed your mind. So this is always going to kill you the first time. It's a guarantee. It does give me pause, because the very next game in the Prince of Persia series after this, it gave you the ability to rewind time up to a certain point.
Which
and it makes me wonder
was
if this was
amazing. Oh my god, I love this. Just seeing this right now, just seeing this frame, literally even just this frame. I want to replay this the Sands of Time series again already. Oh my god, I love them so much. I've been wanting to play them on stream for such a long time now.
design solution to implementing these death traps and otherwise getting around situations where one wrong maneuver will cause you to fall to your death. It makes sense if that were the case, because it's a simple but no doubt difficult to program means of getting around design issues like this. But we're not talking about Sands of Time, we're talking about Prince of Persia 3D/Arabian Nights. All of
God, I want to play it so bad again.
this combines to create a game
Maybe we should do a Prince of Persia marathon. No.
that, despite moments of enjoyment, is fascinatingly awful. It's a complete mess of misguided and poor design, and it all comes down to one issue. They tried to faithfully adapt the gameplay from 2D to 3D, but they clearly didn't test much, or if they didn't have the time to meaningfully implement any sort of change to the design because it's flawed at a fundamental level and would require an entire design overhaul. But either way, they tried to preserve the simple combat of the 2D
Imagine a remake of this, but like actually good.
Games, despite the fact that going to 3D opened them up to much greater depth of sword combat, and the result is awful. Translating the precision platforming that required incredibly precise movement didn't really work because the technology just wasn't there to have that sort of gameplay control well in 3D. It was made worse by the controls in the PC version, and the trademark death traps that define the experience of a Prince of Persia game were outright rendered visually indistinct with the more complicated graphics and the reduced viewpoint that they had. Basically, this game fails on a fundamental level due to accuracy. Now that I've played it though, does its reputation hold up? Is it one of the worst translations from 2D to 3D? I don't think so. It's at least playable and has some enjoyable aspects. Like I said, when the platforming is at its best, there are some pretty enjoyable sequences. Meanwhile, I think the gold standard for terrible 3D transitions would—
Yeah, but Bubsy 3D isn't even a real game. Like, come on. What I find interesting about this video is, again, the title. The absolute worst parts of early 3D gaming, but then he spends the entire video talking about one game, basically, even after Bubsy. I'm mentioning a few other games, I see it right here. I'm scrubbing through the timeline. Mentioning a few other ones only to get back to Prince of Persia again. Stop with the misleading titles. I thought it would be like a collection of or like a video essay on different games, how they handled it and why and blah, and it's just basically it's just a Prince of Persia 3D review.
Bubsy 3D. But then again, a birthday cake made of manure would look favorable standing next to Bubsy 3D. Then there's also Mega Man X7, where from what I understand, Keiji Inafune actively shot down any developer's attempts to try and design the game for 3D space, assuming that simply taking the same design philosophies and converting it to 3D would make an equally good game. Not what it ended up being, one of the worst Mega Man games ever made. Though to be fair, apparently that may have been referencing the graphics specifically, but given the design of the game, if they weren't specifically trying to take 2D sensibilities and convert it to 3D without any sort of translation or any sort of idea about how 3D space is utilized compared to 2D, well, the game certainly doesn't do a good job of convincing you of that.
I have a similar problem with Portal, the Flash version map pack. There is, you might remember the Portal Flash game. I made a short about it. That came out before even Portal itself, but it was fan-made. It was made by two people, by two guys who saw the Portal trailers and were so fascinated that they wanted to do something of their own as well. And they took some liberties and turned it into Portal Flash game. And that got so big that one of the devs ended up translating it into 3D and pulling it out as a Portal mod. I forgot. I think it was called Portal the Flash version map pack. A mod for Portal that basically turned all the Flash version levels into 3D. But those were 2D levels where you see the entire level in one screen, and now you're in 3D in first person. It feels like a 2D game because you're just going from A to B, just a straight line. And it's in first person, and you don't see anything because all the rooms are super small, because in the Flash version, they played around with the size of the rooms, and some rooms were small and had like little holes and whatever. It just doesn't work in 3D. I didn't like it very much. But that mod was so popular that it even ended up being sort of official. The Xbox version of Portal, called Portal Still Alive, included some of those levels of that mod. So in a way, it is official. So in a way, you could say that Portal the Flash version, the Flash game that came out before Portal that was fan-made, was technically the first official Portal game, retroactively. Which is interesting and weird to think about. But those levels just don't work for me, because they were made for 2D, and they weren't translated, they weren't adapted, they were literally just taken and turned into 3D, basically, without changing anything about them to actually make them work in 3D.
fact. And then there's something like Robotron X, which was a 3D remake of the 80s arcade game Robotron. And without wishing to be dramatic, it's the worst fucking game I've ever played. Whereas Prince of Persia 3D is still fundamentally poorly designed and should still be held as a poor example of what it goes for, even if there are worse games than it. Still, the lessons to be learned from it are obsolete. Not to assume that design philosophies can carry over seamlessly from situation to situation. You need to design for what you're making. Don't make a first-person shooter with the design philosophies of a 3D platformer.
Yes.
Don't make a real-time strategy game with the design philosophies of a rhythm game. But these
Yes.
are obvious lessons that every game developer worth their salt should already know. So it's not really worth banging on about. It's only for the lulz that we look back on examples of games that failed at this very simple design philosophy. Even still, I do find myself weirdly captivated by Prince of Persia 3D / Arabian Nights. I mean, I've beaten the Dreamcast version twice now, so there must be something to this game
The Dreamcast version twice and the PC version. Dude, is crazy.
that fascinates me for whatever reason. Maybe it's because it's a weird one-off deviation from the rest of the series. You had the first 2 games, you had the Sands of Time trilogy, you had a few other things, and then right in the middle you have this odd
Sands of Time quadrilogy, thank you.
duck just sitting there. And I'm a fan of odd ducks in larger franchises. The same reason why I'm fascinated by something like Resident Evil Dead Aim. Because it's an intriguing but also largely forgotten one-off. I guess I'll just sum it up like this. I'm weird. If you like this video and want to support the channel, you can leave a like, subscribe, tell me what you think in the comment section, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a shame that this is basically just a Prince of Persia 3D review, because again, the title is just misleading. And that's a shame. But, good video nonetheless. I like it.